A fleet of Russian warships led by a guided missile cruiser have set sail from their Arctic base for joint naval exercises off Venezuela near U.S. waters. Russian Navy said the fleet includes the nuclear-powered guided missile cruiser Peter the Great and an anti-submarine warship. The exercises, not seen since the Cold War in the Caribbean Sea, are expected to take place in November or December. The deployment follows the arrival of 2 Russian nuclear bombers in Venezuela earlier this month, also for the exercises, an event that Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez branded a warning to the U.S. empire.
A smaller, better armed and more flexible armed force. Russia's president says the country's military will be upgraded to respond to growing threats from without.
There still remains the threats coming from local conflicts as well as from international terrorism. Attempts to expand NATO close to the borders of our country have not been stopped. All of this demands a new perspective and quality modernization of our armed forces.
The eastward expansion of the military alliance is a principal concern for Russia. Even before the Baltic states joined NATO, the alarm bells were ringing. But the prospect of the former Soviet republics of Ukraine and Georgia gaining membership is more than Moscow can bear.
Medvedev just wanted to remind that NATO's key purpose is to counter terrorism and not to enlarge and go further to the east.
1-0.
To make matters worse, the US is planning to install a missile shield in Eastern Europe, to which Russia is adamantly opposed. The combination of factors motivated the Kremlin to modernize its forces and to advertise that it was bulking up its deterrence.
The primary goal is to improve the combat readiness of our troops, a substantial one, mainly in the area of strategic nuclear arms.
Now, 10 Russian ships have been deployed at the Syrian port of Pt.2 based on an accord reached by the two sides after the August South Caucasus conflict. Head of the Russian Black Sea Fleet Operation Directorate said the Russian engineering crew was at Tartus to expand the capacity of the harbor to host additional fleet vessels. Rear Admiral Andrei Voronov added the teams will also be working on expanding Latakia, another Syrian port, possibly for aircraft carriers, for guided missile cruisers. On September 12th, nearly 1 month after the South Caucasus conflict broke out, Russia and Syria reached an agreement that would provide Moscow with a long-term base rights at Syrian ports. We have Professor Scott Lucas, Professor of the American Studies at the University of Birmingham. Sir, welcome to our program. As you know, 10 Russian warships will be in the Mediterranean Sea. Is this a signal for the United States that Russia will be more active in the Middle East?
It is a signal that Russia will be more active in the Middle East and around the world. And around the world. Russia has also sent aircraft to Venezuela this past week. They have announced that they may increase their military assistance to Iran. But in the Middle East specifically, yes. What Russia is saying, if you were going to try to limit us by putting NATO on our borders, say by trying to bring NATO into Georgia and Ukraine, we will show that we have power elsewhere. So we will look, for example, in the Middle East, where I think the United States has been, let us say the American reputation has been diminished, then Russia will increase its links, say, with Syria. I think you can look to see Russia to take an independent stance on the Israel-Palestine conflict. I also would not rule out Russia, for example, exerting its influence on the energy markets to, say, for example, maneuver with OPEC and with Saudi Arabia.
So, Sky. Well, I mean, we meet right now under very interesting circumstances. We are on the brink, on the eve of a potential third world war. I think a lot of people right now in our viewing audience are seeing the build-up to this. They're seeing a lot of elements right now which are becoming very difficult to miss. That there's a drive currently for, on the one hand, a banker's dictatorship throughout Europe, on the U.S. On the U.S. home front as well. where in the face of an economic collapse, policies are planned to be pushed through, major austerity policies are being pushed through in the interest of maintaining an imperial system that's right now on the brink of collapse. Now, the major threat to being able to do that has been what we've been organizing here with the LaRouche Political Action Committee, what Mr. LaRouche has been organizing, which is a potential collaboration between the United States, Russia, and China on major infrastructure development projects, on the future evolutionary development of the human species. The present drive for world war is launched directly against that. This is not an attack meant to target Iran. This is not meant to target Syria. The series of coups that you're seeing throughout European nations, dumping existing leaders and putting into place patsies who are tools of imperial financial interests, this is designed to stop exactly that sort of evolutionary development of the human species. Their stated intention is to wreck the possibility of a trans-Pacific alliance between the U.S., China, and Russia, and to launch instead the kind of destabilizing warfare that would prevent that development from taking place. Now, the danger right now is that the only kind of warfare that they have at hand to destabilize a Russia or China is nuclear weaponry. That's the only thing we have. We're in a situation right now where traditional warfare will not work. And as a result, we're facing the threat of the very real threat of a potential nuclear Armageddon. And in order for us to understand, in order for the American population, the world population, to understand what actually is driving this, they're going to have to drop the idea of an over-reliance on evidence from sense perception and to regain a principle that's unique to the human species, a capability to realize what are the driving principles behind this. What are the powers that are at war? And most notably now, this is the question of a battle between a republic, which is the physical social manifestation of the human creativity, the human species, and empire, which is antithetical to that, which prides itself, which is only driving characteristic is its hatred of human creativity.
You've got the human species to look at first, and other species earlier than the human species. And you recognize that the trend in biology for the past 500 million years is essentially a progressive movement of higher qualities of species from the long period of the single-cell species, a long drive to rise to higher and higher levels of species as the dominant species on the planet, and obviously beyond as well. So, but what we have instead in what we call historical times, we have a trend of what is called the oligarchical trend, the oligarchical principle, in which a small part of a dominant culture becomes what we call an oligarchical system, which treats the majority of the human species as if they were cattle, and tries to use them as cattle and to keep them down to a minimum in numbers, which is contrary to the entirety of the logic of life as we know life on this planet and beyond. The emergence of this oligarchical system, which becomes a dominant feature of human culture, so that you have those people who call themselves gods, actually, and the term for gods is that the ruling class, which are supposed to be the gods, and the rest of the human race is supposed to be kept down to a certain minimal, and also minimal capabilities, minimal intellect, minimal this. So the struggle has been that mankind is naturally disposed toward creativity. This is what the real distinction of mankind. We have the ability for voluntary creativity. Other species have ways in which they are creative, but it's not voluntary. It's built into them, like an animal reflex. And we human beings have actual creativity, creative powers. Now the struggle has been since the oligarchy is a predatory type, which preys upon people But it needs people in order to be victims of this predatory arrangement. But they don't want the people to become too smart or too numerous, for fear that the oligarchy would be overwhelmed by a large number of human beings. So this has become what's known as the oligarchical principle. Now, the form we're most familiar with from a European civilization side, transatlantic side, is the Roman Empire. There were a great number of different kinds of empires dominated by oligarchical principles. But there was an attempt to consolidate them around a single Mediterranean empire, based empire, which became, through a long process of competition, killing each other and that sort of thing, became the Roman Empire. The world today is still dominated by the Roman Empire. Now, of course, the original Roman Empire, by that name, came to a disaster, a self-inflicted disaster. But then you had Byzantium, which emerged to replace the collapsed Roman Empire. Then Byzantium went to a collapse. It was a complicated collapse involving the whole Charlemagne period and so forth, which was contesting this kind of thing. Then you went on to, beyond this type of thing, you went to the overcoming of Charlemagne. After his death, the whole system began to collapse of Charlemagne. And then you had a period of what we might call the Crusaders. And the Crusader system was a system of chaos, which led into a dark age in the 14th century. But then there was despite the attempt to establish civilization, which is centered around what happened in Florence, the Florentine Renaissance, there was again using religious warfare now as a way to destroy civilization and to restore a Roman Empire. Now, this went through a long period of struggles from 1492 to 1648. And coming out of that was then a new empire, a new form of the Roman Empire, which became the British Empire, emerged from a war process in the beginning of the 18th century, this process. So now we are still dominated by a British Empire, and it still is the dominant empire on this planet. There is resistance, strong resistance to the tyranny of the Roman Empire, that is now the British Empire, as from Russia still, as from China, and from other parts of the world. There's the surge, the desire for freedom. But the dominant force has continued to be the Roman Empire in its British form. And the only serious challenge to it earlier was the United States. That was the one force that really challenged the British Empire. However, with the corruption of the United States, like the assassination of McKinley, for example, which led to Teddy Roosevelt, who's a complete bum. That's the kind of thing you say about him. Wilson, the guy who reorganized the Ku Klux Klan bigger than ever, as president of the United States and right for the White House. And then you had Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt took us back into the direction of our intention. Then the death of Roosevelt was used by the British, and certain corruptions they engaged in order to turn the power back to the British Empire. And with the assassination of two Kennedys, first the President Jack Kennedy, and then the elimination of his brother who was about to become president. And this process has sent the entire transatlantic region in particular down, down, down ever since. We have been in decadence and decline ever since. Now we've reached the point that the British Empire is staking an attempt to eliminate the United States, to eliminate any independent nation in Europe. That is, there are no nations in Europe, in the Western Europe. They're all part of a governance